everybody. Welcome to Fab A to Z episode 12. Today, we're taking a deep dive with a great player, my friend Aaron, newest to the card guys, among one other player as well, in the form of Taylor. But today, we're going to be talking about an amazing new Illusionist hero. Illusionist, a hero that can be a little bit divided in the community. Some people absolutely adore the building of board control and being able to tackle certain matchups from a different avenue, while other players cannot stand having to deal with shields blocking their way to smashing their opponent's faces in. Aaron, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody? Tell us who you are, how long you've been playing Enigma and or Illusionist, and what are some of your notable accomplishments?
Yeah, so I'm Aaron Grace, newest member of the Card Guys. I consider myself to be quite proficient with Illusionist. I've been playing since Monarch came out, and I was an original Prism main. Um, and I've been playing Illusionist basically the entire time I've been playing Flesh and Blood. I don't exclusively play Illusionist. Once the original Prism LL'd, I kind of was forced into new ventures, and I found a lot of heroes I liked. I am kind of like a tournament grinder type player, so I do like to play what's viable, and Illusionist isn't always the best pick, right? But whenever an Illusionist is good, I tend to gravitate towards that play style. I really like the way they build, the way they play, and I'm a big fan of Enigma. I think Enigma kind of embodies a lot of what I liked about Original Prism. And when I first saw her spoiled in Mistveil, I was very excited to return to that type of illusionist gameplay that Dromai and the new Prism just like didn't quite scratch that itch for me. Recently, I took Enigma to U.S. Nationals. I made top four, eventually losing to KO in an unfortunate game. But yeah, so I've played her a lot since she came out. She hasn't been out for a super long time, but Illusionist chops kind of carry over hero to hero to a little bit. But I really enjoy her.
All right, very cool. Now, Enigma is a little different from illusionists that we've had in the past. They were usually very concerned about their either big herald attacks or building a board state that was very overwhelming in the form of dragons. Enigma is building a board state kind of like Dromai did, but everything is a shield, everything is a ward thing. What do you think about her different design? Like, do you like this better than the other illusionist designs?
So the main difference with the way Enigma's board state works compared to what other Illusionist has done is that in the past, when Prism played her Spectra auras and Dromai played dragons, the opponent was forced into a decision on whether or not they needed to attack the board directly by, declaring their attacks on the dragons or whatever and killing it, or attacking the illusionists themselves to pressure their life total, pressure their hand. Enigma's a little bit different because the wards are mostly uninteractable. You can't attack them. However, they're always pressured by attacking Enigma directly. So
Mm-hmm.
you kind of get, when you play against Enigma, you kind of get the best of both worlds where you get to attack Enigma's face and her board at the same time. So you don't have the decision fatigue that you used to have when playing against other illusionists. On the flip side, that means that Enigma also gets the choice in how she wants to play out her turns defensively and what she wants to set up on her following turn, because your opponent can't make the correct choice because they're always attacking you. You get to decide what is important to you. The reason why I like Enigma's gameplay and why I kind of like related it to the original Prism and not necessarily the newer Illusionists is that her auras generally, a few exceptions, are low costed and low powered compared to some of the other things. Like Prism's light spectra auras are extremely powerful effects, but they have a heavy cost both in playing them out and just like with how deck interactions go. Enigma is very flexible. Her cards are pretty easy to establish, but they're also a lot easier to remove. So you make more of those important decision points in a game. You have 40 life, and your games will tend to drag on a little bit as you block and gain effective life via ward. And the longer you drag the game out, the more value you can accumulate from your board state game plan. So
Nah.
generally, that's why I like Enigma.
Oh yeah. Honestly, I wholeheartedly agree. This is the Illusionist that I haven't built yet. I built
Mm.
Prism, I built New Prism, and I built Dromai. Although I played Dromai for like a month and then got over it and never played her again. Continually bought new cards for her, wasted a lot of money on Tomes of Imperial Flames, and never played them. But this is a hero I haven't built yet, but I want to build her because just like you said, she's coming at it from kind of the old school Prism angle in the form of like just overwhelming them with small Kadachi style attacks and the small like shields that have +1 counters on them, and then big dumb attacks in the form of like Miragai and 10,000 Year Reunion if you are playing that card, uh, Enigmas in general. But I think that she's kind of interesting. Like a lot of people's biggest complaints with this hero were about not this hero with Illusionist as a class. It's like I don't want to swing at Spectra and waste my whole attack / my go again on that. It's like, all right, we'll give you dragons. Well, I don't want to have to kill dragons. I played I think it was a ProQuest or a Road to Nationals, I can't remember, and it was like a heavy Dromai room, and I had my friend borrow Phi, and I was like, oh yeah, it's a bunch of Dromais, you'll do fine. And he kept coming back to me telling me that he had lost, and I'm like, what's going on? He's like, well, I didn't kill the dragons, and it's like, what? And then this is the hero where like you don't have to waste your attack by targeting a spectra, by targeting a specific dragon. You get to just target the hero. But let me tell you, I have never felt more helpless against an illusionist than I have against Enigma. I've had a policy in the past of like we're ignoring the spectra. After a certain point in the match, I'm ignoring the dragons. Like you can't ignore Enigma's ward. It's literally in the way of your victory. So I'm very curious to see how players grow to adapt into either love or hate Enigma. Hopefully, it's mostly love because I think she's pretty darn cool. I love her design. But,
Yeah, I think bringing that up about how Enigma punishes players more than or in a different way that other illusionists did. I think the biggest thing with Enigma and what I like the most about her gameplay is that probably more than any other hero in the game, she punishes missteps the
mm,
best. And when I say misstep, I don't necessarily mean like your opponent made a mistake, right?
mm-hmm,
Um, it could just be that they drew a really poor hand,
mm-hmm.
which in Flesh and Blood, that happens. There's variance to the card game. Everyone has, bad turns, bad
The
games,
all red
and
hand, something like
for
that.
sure, Flesh and Blood is a game where each card in your hand has a specific role. You either want to play it, you either want to pitch it for resources. Maybe you're playing a deck that requires synergies between different card types. So
Mm-hmm.
with Rune Blade, you need a mixture of attacks and non-attack actions.
Oh, the no
Rangers,
arrow hand, yeah.
yeah. Azalea needs a good mixture of arrows and ways to buff that arrow.
Mm-hmm.
And too much of one type of card or another can really lower the average output of your turn. And Enigma punishes that very hard
Mm-hmm.
because in a normal game when you're just going back and forth, if you have one bad turn, it might cost you some life because maybe you weren't able to block as much as you'd like to, or your output wasn't good enough so you don't strip cards from your opponent or whatever the reason. But normally you can kind of come back in most cases from a misstep like that.
Mm-hmm.
Enigma punishes that beyond just a life total swing because if you don't have the ability to realize the output that your deck is built to do
Mm-hmm.
against Enigma, then you're not pressuring the board she has. And if she, let's say she's already established a bit of a board state, if you draw a clunker and you can't pressure that board, well, not only does she get to keep it for another round of attacks on you to get value, but she also gets to establish additional board on top of that. Now, when you go back to your following turn after that, maybe your hand is actually functional this time, but now she has
Mm-hmm.
double the amount of board you have to punch through. And that just keeps cascading to
Mm-hmm.
where you kind of feel like even though you don't have to worry about attacking Spectra, dealing with dragons that, you have to choose to attack, you can just keep attacking Enigma, but you kind of get in this spiral where like I keep attacking Enigma, but like it's just not working. Like her health, I can't kill her. Her health total is not going down. She's effectively gaining life with all of these ability ward on the board. The ward, is stopping my on hits. She's very flexible on how she gets to block because she can cover up the breakpoints with either cards in their hand, defense reactions, or ward that's already on the board. You can
Mm-hmm.
choose to value which ward or the other, and you just kind of feel like you're getting smothered. And whenever your deck doesn't agree with you, it's just it's faster and faster snowball.
Absolutely. My perspective comes from draft mostly, but there was a game against an assassin where I had my board state and then I draw up and it's like, oh, okay, this is the rebuild hand. I'll go ahead and let them take my board and I'll rebuild and come back. And then they drew a hand that was all non-attacks and their turn was just like dagger, dagger. I was like, oh, cool. I'll just build on top of my old board and it's going to go crazy. Like, absolutely. Enigma's great at that.
Yes, I really like her flexibility. I like like I said, how punishing she is. Just it's very fun to play. I mean,
Hmm.
I tend to like slower strategies. I like playing Guardian and other decks that want to accumulate value over a long period of time. And Enigma just kind of does that in a more interesting way because you're playing on that different axis than just like a slow mechanologist or a guardian or something like that where you're just trading a lot and you're getting number value over the course of the game. Enigma, you're playing on a different axis and trying to snowball a permanent on the board, which I really like.
Absolutely. All right, well then let's dive into the meat and potatoes of this. Introduce us to the what style of deck do we have here today? Do you think that this is a Enigma that is kind of tackling a specific and or upcoming meta, or is this more of like an evergreen Enigma that you think that you would kind of always be able to adapt to any type of meta?
So I think there are play lines and cards that are always going to exist in Enigma's toolkit, that are just good in almost any matchup and meta. Transcending is just a core part of her ability.
Absolutely.
Miraging is one of the best cards in her deck, and it's flexible enough to basically be played in any context.
Yeah,
This
mirror
deck
guy.
specifically is a bit different than what I played at Nationals and what I believed was the ways that you could play before this set came out.
Hmm.
The biggest thing that had changed, up into the release of Rosetta, obviously, was the big ban that LSS did. Zen was your worst matchup by quite a big margin.
Hmm.
That matchup was almost unwinnable. And to even make the matchup semi-playable, you had to really warp your deck to try and beat him. You needed ward, board state, blocking. That stuff didn't matter to him. His output was just so high that he could kill you through any like defensive plans you tried to do. So the only real like viable way to fight Zen was to try and race him and match his aggression. So you would play big phantasm attacks. You try and play more go again attacks. Just high rate offense to try and pressure his life total as fast as
Hmm.
possible, so he doesn't find his key combo pieces.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
would play disruptive things like weakest link, command and conquer, even pummel.
Hmm.
And even when you warped your deck that way, the matchup still wasn't great. And those strategies aren't as good into other matchups as what Enigma's base game plan is. So, what you kind of had the option of was I can either make the Zen matchup as okay as I can make it and have a slightly worse matchup into the field, but, generally you can kind of still get there, or you can ignore Zen, hope you dodge it, and just build a deck that beats everything else.
Hmm.
Well, now that Zen's gone and Enigma didn't receive any direct bans, you can kind of do that latter with no downside, right? You can build the deck to tackle the other heroes in the metagame, which is kind of what this list is. It's going more all in on the board state, the ward plan. It's not big on like disruption because you're trying to outvalue decks that can't keep up with you,
Hmm.
that don't just kill you instantly.
And these new Earth decks are a
Yep.
little bit slow.
Yep, the new heroes are a little bit on the slower side. Even the aggro decks, which aggro is generally your best game plan into Enigma, just
Hmm.
because you need the consistent output to pressure her hand, pressure her board state.
Hmm.
The new aggro heroes, while strong and like some of the old aggro heroes did get decent upgrades,
Hmm.
they're not Zen, right? So you actually have ways to counteract them and a hope, to win in
Hmm.
that sense. So this list goes really heavily in on board state and outvaluing people with that.
Hmm. Absolutely. Alrighty then. Let's see. So why why play this hero over others currently?
Um, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with what I just said. Enigma already had a really strong matchup into a lot of the heroes, and those matchups still stand, right? So anything slow that can't present large damage numbers um, on a consistent basis kind of struggle against Enigma because Enigma is generally pretty good at blocking
Hmm.
and she knows when it is important to block, or you as a player would preferably know when it is important to block. And if you can't punch through in crucial times, you're just going to get outvalued too hard. So decks like Assassin and Guardian, they really struggle into decks like Enigma, and even the aggro decks. Like I said, you have tools to kind of get around that. So I just think her matchup spread is very consistent in the metagame,
Hmm.
and even among other illusionists, which were very polarizing heroes, where you had a bunch of free win matchups and a bunch of extremely difficult matchups, I feel like Enigma is kind of like at another level currently where you have those borderline free win matchups,
Hmm.
but your bad matchups, so to speak, are totally reasonable to expect to win. So I just think she's very powerful. Her game plan is very powerful right now.
Yeah.
Her cards are very powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like you said before, without Zen to really prey upon Enigma, she doesn't have too many terrible options just because her game plan is so efficient at what it's trying to do. Talk to me about your equipment real quick. So, Traverse the Universe is still in, of course. Meridian Pathway. Do you ever actually use the first line of text on this, or is it usually just a Ward 3?
So generally, it's mostly a Ward 3.
Mm-hmm.
However, just Ward 3 on your equipment, is kind of an
It's
understatement.
pretty
That's a
good.
very powerful ability. Being able to block for 3 on demand is very good in a hero
Hmm.
that really wants to be able to block in certain situations to keep a board or establish a board that just overwhelms your opponent, right? Being able to do it at instant speed is really good. There's a lot of play lines you can do that involve, transcending on your opponent's turn, blocking with Traverse the Universe to get that chi, and then perhaps, your opponent is throwing their last attack at you. You did the math and you can cover it perfectly. You cast your Miraging on their turn, you turn
Hmm.
on your boots, you get the extra 3 block, you go to your turn with Miraging up. Um,
Oof.
so the Ward 3 is very powerful. The first line of text is actually pretty strong.
Mhm.
Being able to play auras out either on your opponent's turn or on your turn and like
Yeah.
kind of cheat action points is pretty good. Especially in this list, particularly as we'll get into. There's a lot more zero cost non go again auras because we're currently playing the Spectra Blues, Shimmers, and Haze Bending,
Mhm.
which we weren't playing much in the past, and that is due to what we'll talk about in a little bit with the equipment suite. But with those in the deck, the Meridian Pathway text gets a lot better to cheat these in because just like Prism playing a light aura and then a blue aura in the same turn, or Mage Master bootsing 2 of these out
Mhm.
at the same time, just playing 2 Spectra in one turn is very powerful. Your opponent can only deal with one at a time, and you're guaranteeing yourself that you get one on the following turn to kind of snowball your advantage. So the
Strict
Meridian Pathway,
upgrade to
both
Mage
texts are
Master
good
boots. Yeah.
for sure. I mean, there are some situations where Mage Master Boots is more efficient because
I'm
it
sure.
costs less
Yeah. Yeah.
resources, but it's not nearly worth how you have to what you have to give up compared to Meridian. Meridian is just a really good card.
Well, I forget that it's when you've pitched a chi, you can ward 3. I thought you had to pitch
Yep.
a chi to ward 3. It's just they happen
Nope.
together separately. That's so good. Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Yeah. That line you just
So
talked about, playing Mirror Guy in your opponent's turn and then warding for 3. That's great.
yep. I mean, you could pitch. You don't even have to like activate a chi ability. You can use it to Enigma's hero power, like in
Hmm.
emergencies if you really need to. You could pitch the chi to Arcane Barrier or whatever the
Hmm.
case is. It's just any time that you pitch that chi, you have the ability to turn the boots on.
Pretty darn good. Concerning Traverse the Universe, do you think Traverse is like really just like an enabler for Mirror Guy? I say that as like it's not a super good thing to do, but like what are some other uses where you're using Traverse aside from Mirror Guy?
So there are some times where you just really, really need a blue card.
Hmm.
Um, this is like probably the best equipment in the game right now. It's probably like the best card in the
Super
game.
good.
It's just so dumb. Like people play Crown of Providence because it's so good. This is just Crown of Providence, but you don't have to get rid of a card and you
Yeah,
know exactly what you're drawing, right?
pretty
And it's
good.
usually like the most important card that you can get, right? It's a guaranteed blue, it's a chi, and Miragai is generally what you go for most of the time just because that play is so strong,
Yeah,
but there are matchups and there are circumstances where there are other things to do. Like I said, sometimes your hand just is completely infunctional,
without a blue.
and yeah, you need that blue or you need the extra card, and
Mhm.
maybe it's a pivotal point in the game where you don't really think you're going to have a better use for it, and it's just kind of like it gets you out of jail free.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
it's pretty sweet.
yeah,
Alrighty. Scroll of Ancestry. Of course, it's all revolving around her whole game plan. Now let's talk about
yeah,
Calming Gesture for a second. Calming
yeah.
Gesture is a new Illusionist card out of the new set Rosetta, which I'll admit the first time I read it, I was like, meh. But on second look, it's just a strict upgrade to Null Rune Gloves. And then you seem to be running it as a little bit more than just AB, preferring to have that instant ability on demand. Talk to me about this.
Yep. So it's my only arm piece. It was quite a
Hmm.
surprise, actually. I wasn't really expecting to get anything in Rosetta after we saw the first spoiler, the boots flitter steps.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I was sure
yeah,
that I thought
those
that'd be the only one. Yeah.
yeah, and those boots are cool. They have an
Mhm.
interesting effect, but I don't think they were quite pushed enough to make it into the deck list at this point, just
Mhm.
because of how contested the boot slots are in Illusionist. You're competing with Meridian Pathway, right?
And
Um,
Footsteps, which is pretty good in its
yeah,
own right. Yeah.
for sure. We play both of those in this deck. So getting Kami Gesture was kind of a bit of surprise. The first thing that you noticed, obviously, is that it has Arcane Barrier 1, right? So we were already playing Null Rune Gloves because, well, you need AB
Hmm.
in a lot of matchups, and Illusionist arms are generally the least important uh, equipment slot. So No Rune Gloves was already in the deck, so you're gonna play this over No Rune Gloves anyways. It's not strictly better. Technically, there is a difference because No Rune Gloves blocks for 0, where this doesn't have
Okay.
a block value.
Okay.
So against T-Bone, some people would bring in No Rune Gloves
Hmm.
in a meta where they expected Mechanologists to play lots of T-Bones, so you can kind of protect your important
Hmm.
equipment from that. I've never personally been a fan of doing that, so that doesn't really matter to me, but it's something to keep in mind, right? But
Gotcha.
so this card was always going to slot in just because it's No Rune Glows with text
Hmm.
and it looks cool, right? So
Hmm.
the Illusionist is going to play
I
it
want to get some cold foil ones of these. I do.
for sure. However, the activated ability is really interesting, and it's kind of shaped how this entire list has been put together,
Mm.
because the main thing that this card does for the deck is it facilitates astral etchings to be your main fuel for your high synergy ward pieces.
Ah.
So outside of Miragai, which is a really powerful broken card that can be played in any context and it's good, your best board state ward synergy cards are 10,000 Year Reunion and Restless Coalescence. These cards need +1 counters to fuel them, and there aren't too many cards currently that just give you a large number of +1 counters necessary to fuel them, kind of out of nowhere.
Hmm.
Your option before was Spectral Manifestations.
Spec Manny. Yep. Yep.
Yep. And Spectral Manifestations kind of it has its own upsides and it has its own downsides. Astral Etchings, the main downside to it was that you couldn't guarantee that it was online because you have
Hmm.
to have a Spectral Shield for it to be played at instant speed. This card doesn't function the way you want it to unless you play it at instant speed.
Hmm.
And the problem with requiring a Spectral Shield is that it's hard to just randomly make one
Hmm.
from a random hand because like not a lot of cards you have just create a Spectral Shield without sinking a bunch of resources into it.
Hmm.
And if you already had a Spectral Shield out, um, it's kind of hard to keep it and then still do the plays you want to do because your opponent's going to be attacking you, obviously, right? And
Yeah.
let's say you have your Spectral Shield out. Well, if you don't block for the Spectral Shield, then it dies, and then you go to your turn, you can't play your Astral Etching. But if you have your Etchings and your combo pieces, you can't block with them because you want to play them, right? So it was always this inconsistency where it was too difficult to line up this card with the cards that you want to combine it with and also have a Spectral Shield. Kami Gesture removes that because you have an on-demand way to make sure that you have a Spectral Shield. So even if your your board is empty. You can go into your turn and you can always guarantee, boom, the first time I want to use astral etchings, it's going to be online. So you can basically build your own spectral manifestations with this and astral etchings.
Honestly, that's great. I didn't
And
realize how strong that combo was.
yep. And astral etchings has a few advantages over spectral manifestations. Number one is that it blocks for 3. That's very good. Both this card and spectral manifestations aren't always playable, right? Spectral manifestations had its own conditions to it. Even with the new gloves, you might not always want to cast this card, and maybe you draw another copy after you use your gloves, and you just don't need it, right? So it being a 3 block makes it a lot more comfortable to play it, whereas manifestations was really bricky sometimes because it punished you for winning because it didn't do its thing if you already had a board.
That's
And
true.
it being a red 2 block meant that you didn't really have a good use for it if you weren't casting it.
Yeah.
Another thing that Astral Etchings is good at is that it doesn't have to put the counters on the Spectral Shield. So there are a couple things that you can do that Spectral Manifestations couldn't do. Number one is that you could put this on a Mirror Guy that's in play. So let's say you had a Mirror Guy, you're attacking with it, it has 4 counters on it, it's coming in for 8. At instant speed, you're not really telegraphing it necessarily because both the gloves and astral would be instant. You can pop your gloves, make a shield, play etchings on the Mirror Guy, and the 3 counters on the Mirror Guy would convert to an extra 6 damage. So you would
You
come
do
in for
all of that off of a blue.
14. Yep, you can come in for 14 with Ward 7. You could also put astral etchings on a Restless coalescence that was already on the board. With manifestations, you always had to have the Restless in hand so that you could play it and then move the counters over to it to get the value. But maybe you already had a Restless out that you've spent all of its counters, or you just played one vanilla and it's just kind of sitting there. Well, you can etchings directly on it to get that value, whereas with manifestations that wouldn't quite work out. So overall, etchings is just a more powerful card. It just had a worse condition than spectral manifestation, but with the new gloves, it facilitates this card to be a lot more consistent. And I've really been liking it for that case.
Heck yeah. No, I like that a lot. I think that's a very cool and interesting game plan. Going to catch a lot of people off guard, and other people just won't be able to react because their deck
Yep.
won't allow them. Very, very cool. Let's talk about the main deck. Is there anything here that you think is pretty standout? I'll admit I don't know that I remember Solitary being a. Was Solitary always in lists before?
No, this is kind of a new inclusion.
Okay.
It's part of making the deck more word focused. The rate on this card is pretty good. If it comes in and your board's empty, you get to make a spectral shield. So let's just say that's a 0 for 4 off of 1 card. It's just another, and even if you don't make the shield, it's still solid. But
Yeah.
it's just another thing to end your turn on that kind of carries value over throughout the course of the game. So it can either be used as effectively another card's worth of block value to protect yourself on the following turn. And it's just another density of card that, like I said, punishes your opponent for having off turns. The more ward that's in your deck, the more likely you are to have that ward when you have the opportunities, or you have it going first. And this card is just like part of that package, and
We've
it's just solid.
we've just seen a lot of ways of getting above a 4-card hand getting banned out of this game. Dropping a Solitary Companion, even if you don't get the shield, like you said, is like an extra 3 block, bumping you up to a 5-card hand. So that inherently does sound very powerful. I like that a lot.
It's kind of cheeky, Enigma dodged the bans because she doesn't draw cards, right? She has her own way of getting extra value.
That's right. Moving on. Dissolve Reality, I believe that was in before, but this card, every time it's played against me and I lose a pivotal arsenal, it just feels so powerful. I could care less about the Ponder. Every time I'm like, I don't want this Ponder.
Yeah, this card's just an all-star. It's uninteractable disruption, which is very good. Enigma generally lacks disruption within her kit, so people will kind of subsidize that with cards like Command and Conquer or those other disruptive attacks. The problem with those cards is that most heroes in the game have a pretty substantial armor suite currently, and most of Enigma's damage is just vanilla, like she's attacking you with ward. So you're not really incentivized to block it with armor unless you're dying. So the opponent's armor just kind of sits there, and when you throw a disruptive attack that needs to hit, they'll just cash in their armor because
Just
they
push
might
it
as well,
right
right?
in.
Like, oh, here you go. Yeah. Dissolve Reality doesn't give them that option, right? If they put a power card in their arsenal, which, cards in arsenal tend to be good because you don't want to arsenal a bad card because you're forced to play it, right? So getting a random card, and usually probably one of their better cards that they can't interact with, just really slows them down. And slowing down your opponent is another way that you can protect yourself, right? Beyond just blocking. A lot of heroes will attack you for more than you can defend by. So being able to slow them down through disruption like this is really powerful to stop them from pressuring you or pressuring your board. And they could easily like not see it coming, right? It's zero go again. Any card in your hand could randomly be this. They can't really just not arsenal all game because then they're not going to snowball enough value between turns to push through you. So they're kind of forced into, using that arsenal, and then you just zip it to the side. And it replaces itself. You get the ponder token even if you yourself don't have an arsenal. So just playing this from your own arsenal or from hand when you don't have an arsenal, it's so good. It's just,
Just value.
get rid of your opponent's good card, slow them down. They get their card back, but you don't really care. It's a random card that they'll get next turn.
And
It did its thing.
worst case
Yep.
scenario, if you can tell they're not going to arsenal, like they're attacking you with the last card in hand, like it still blocks for 3. That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. It blocking for 3 is so crazy. Like
Yeah.
it's just it's so flexible. Like the only downside to it is that I guess it's a yellow, but like it could have been a red and it's probably still
Yeah,
good, right? Like,
exactly.
yeah.
It's
I mean,
good
if it was a
enough.
blue, it'd be so broken as a
Oh,
blue
it'd be
card, but like,
crazy.
even in a yellow, it's like it's a good card. It's all
it
star for
it'll
sure.
do.
Yep.
Moving right along, great defense in the form of Fate Foreseen and Sink Below. Like any card, any
Yeah.
deck that wants to kind of protect things, these cards are just primo. Blue Sink Below. Now, this isn't something that's new. I believe Enigmas were on this before, but it was kind of just explained to me that it turns on your cheese. And it's like it's an okay rate. It's not the best thing in the world, but do you like it?
Yeah, so blue D reacts are generally, I think, my preferred way to transcend mostly,
Mm.
other than just if you have 2 transcend cards in your hand, that's kind of like the freest way to do it. But you
Hmm.
don't always have a good use for both chi when you do that. And so having one of them be a block 2, could be better than just having a chi, and it's very
Yeah.
free to do so, right? You just play your blue D react, you can transcend and then do whatever with your chi. Um,
You could even, in
before,
theory, bottom it.
yeah. Yeah, and that's why I like Sink Below the best out of all of them right now, is because you play your Transcend card in response to the Sink Below while it's still resolving. Your Chi flips, and then if you don't need that Chi, either because it doesn't block and you want to try you need to find a blocking card, or you just don't need it for anything in your turn, you just sink it to the bottom and you draw a real card. So I really like that interaction. That comes up
Also
quite a
turn
bit.
that on too.
Yeah, you could bottom a chi with the sink and then immediately retutor it with Traverse the Universe. That
Oh,
does that can come up.
that's pretty
Um,
nifty.
but that interaction I just think comes up a lot, and I
Mhm.
think it's the best blue D react, especially because of the bannings. Hold the line got a lot less value. That was
Yeah.
one that for sure I played because it was so much value against those heroes that were just drawing a bunch of cards like
Mhm.
Ninja and Brute. Um, and at the time I was playing like 3 Hold the Line and Sink Belows, but I'm playing a little bit fewer blue D reacts right now, and
Mhm.
I don't think you need Hold the Line. Like Brute still does the Blood Rush Bellow thing, but I think this deck is a lot better into Brute than Enigma was before with her old way she tooled the deck. So I don't think you need Hold the Line to make that matchup good. So I think it's much more important to have the one that's more generally applicable, because Hold the Lines just doesn't really do anything versus anyone else now because they banned all the books.
Yeah, absolutely agreed on that one. Miraging Metamorph, being a former Prism player, much like you, I always thought of
Yeah,
this as the best starter. Now it's kind of the best finisher.
yeah. The rate on it is just really strong. 1 for 7, 3 block attack action. It has Phantasm, but it kind of doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone who's played against it, when playing against Prism, kind of understands how the Enigma is not going to be sad if you pop this if it
Yeah.
gets to copy something, right?
I'd be thrilled.
Yeah. So with the, we're playing the spectra. Even if you copy something as small as like a spectral shield or a smaller ward, you're still getting value back. So the
Mhm,
downside of Phantasm is heavily negated. A lot of people will get spooked by the ability and they
mhm,
won't want to pop it, even when maybe it's correct to do so.
mhm,
So a lot of the times you just treat it like it doesn't have Phantasm, and it's a good way to push additional damage, and because you still have to win the game too, right? You have to reduce their life total to 0 most of the time. So, this is just one of the better cards at doing that, and it blocks 3. So it's just like it's an illusionist all star. It doesn't have go
absolutely.
again like old Prism was able to give it, but it's still pretty good
Yeah.
outside of that.
Um, Moving on to Restless Coalescence, this was a card that I remember that I think the first time I read it as a spoiler, I didn't quite get it. I was like, oh, that artwork is sick, but I don't really think this card's going to be all that special. And then I saw it played. And this card does such cool things on offense, but also defense in the way that it can like gain you extra shields by just moving counters around. Like, this card is so cool. Talk to me about cool things and fun things that you've done with Restless Coalescence.
Yeah, so this is one of the most fun cards to play in the deck. It's also just like one of the better cards. As a base value, Ward 2 at instant speed for free is pretty good. If you compare it to like the Essence of Ancestry cards, like we're playing the blue one, 0 cost Ward 2, but those are action speed. It's just that's kind of like a decent enough rate for Ward. If we're paying 0 for a Ward 3 in
Mm-hmm.
solitary, Restless is just like kind of on rate, and the
Mm-hmm.
instant speed is definitely a big deal.
Oh,
But the
yeah.
ability on it is just like it's so powerful,
Mm-hmm.
especially when playing cards like spectral manifestations, or in this case astral etchings, because you get to just double up on the value in multiple ways. So if you put any counter you put on this, not only are you getting the additional damage from that counter, but you get to convert it into an extra spectral shield, and that spectral shield could convert into another damage or multiple depending on how many times you attack with it, plus the life gain. So a lot of the common combo synergies that you're going to do with this is you'll attack with your aura, your spectral shield, whatever. You'll play your astral etchings. You're gonna get the value from the counters, from the ward that's attacking with the counters. Then you play the restless. The counters move over to this. You attack with this, and they'll all have go again because of Cosmo's ability,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll basically be able to deal double damage for each +1 counter you have. And on top of that, this becomes a spectral shield factory, which just helps you keep your life total high, helps you cover breakpoints, gives you extra things to attack with. It keeps astral etchings online. Um, it the value just compounds so highly when you combine it with anything that makes +1 counter. Shimmers of Silver, Waxing Specter, Astral Etching, even Miragai. As much as it like is cringy to say about removing counters about on Miragai,
Mm-hmm.
because Miragai's so good. Like sometimes getting your Miragai attack value and then moving the counters over to Restless to get that value as well, like ends up being really good. Um, it could be a really sneaky play in a lot of matchups because people won't expect the transfer of value
Mm-hmm.
as much. So like let's say you're playing against an Earth hero, right? And one of the new cards that they have to combat Enigma is Summer's Fall. So Summer's
Mm.
Fall would bottom an aura. So let's say you have a big Mirror guy out and they're going to Summer's Fall, and they're going to target your Mirror guy. Well, that's a lot of value lost. Well, you could play the Restless in response to it and kind of split the +1 counters and kind of move the value around and
Mm-hmm.
reallocate it to different purposes so that you're affected less by, cards like Summer's Fall or different types of effects that would otherwise, slow you down. So it's just a very flexible card. It does a lot of things, and a lot of the coolest play patterns and most like thought provoking play patterns, a lot of times involve this card.
I love that moving the value from a Summer's Fall. That's pretty cool because I remember thinking Summer's Fall was just such a great counter to Enigma, and it is. But if you
Mm-hmm.
can combat that disadvantage that they presented by just putting out a Restless Coalescence, that's pretty sweet. I'll say I also was impressed by this card early on when I saw that it can almost make your opponent feel a little like their efforts have been futile. Like if you swing
Yeah.
a spec manny, like a shield with 3 counters on it, and they block for 4 off of a sink below because they're low on health, you'll say, just like you said, you then move all those counters over onto Restless Coalescence, and they just feel like all that was for naught, and that's so powerful.
Yeah, it really adds to that feeling like you're being smothered.
Hmm.
Um, the more things that are staring at you from across the table when you're playing against Enigma, the scarier it is. And this card, probably spits out the most number of permanents that you
Hmm.
can make. So, if you ever look at an Enigma's board and they just have like 9 things sitting there and the opponent just can't crack through, it's probably because this thing did something ridiculous.
Moving right along. Blue Enigma Chimera is still in there. It's a good raid. It blocks for 3, I imagine. That's pretty much the gist of that.
Yeah, Enigma doesn't really rely on Phantasm, and people know that, so they don't board in additional high-powered attacks to counter it like they would against Prism or Dromai.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do play the Phantasm attacks, you're a lot more free to do so because they're not over-teching for that type of gameplay. So a lot of times, the Enigma Chimera just the Phantasm text just isn't relevant, or even against decks that have a bunch of poppers, like you're only really playing it if you just have an excess of cards and you're blue flooded and you just need something to do. And a lot of times you're okay if they're blocking this because, if they're blocking this, they're not threatening you, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
always good for you. It's pretty bad to block versus Enigma. And this is like a 2 for 6 blue card. It's just a really good. It's a great rate. The 2 cost comes in a lot of cost curve if you have an aura with a
Mm.
counter on it.
Oh
You
yeah.
can attack with that aura for 1, and then you have 2 floating. You can end with an Enigma Chimera. So it's just a very solid, titanium bauble, we'll call it. Enigma wants a certain amount of blue 3 blocks in her deck because you have to block sometimes. So that number in the bottom right is very, very important in this hero, especially because a lot of other cards that you're forced to play just don't block at all. So you're looking for generally the best of the best in those 3 blocks, and Enigma Chimera is just probably one of the better attacks that you can put in.
I mean, 2 for 6 is usually a red rate, so yeah, I definitely
Mm-hmm.
agree. As far as titanium baubles go, this thing's nuts.
Yep,
Real quick,
Phantasm will do
zooming
that.
through some ones that we all kind of know and love. Drop in the ocean. I can't speak. How do you say this word?
Homage,
Homage?
homage,
Homage. There
homage.
it is. We got there.
Yeah, there it is.
Homage to ancestors. Plus 1 life, turn into an inner chi. All the inner chis we know are great. Sacred art is awesome when it lines up and you can do all the things. Manifestation of Miraging is just a boat. There's so many cool lines with this card, and even if you don't pitch an inner chi, it's still pretty darn good. Like this is a good one. Blue E strike in the form of levels of enlightenment. I've so many times seen you get at least like draw a card, go again off of this, which is pretty good. Every once in a while it'll come in for 5 too. But talk to me about haze bending and shimmers. I know that shimmers is an amazing illusionist card, but in Enigma, it's kind of about a lot of your cards care about you not having a board state, or at least it used to. Is shimmers coming in now because you've kind of changed the identity a little bit of this deck?
Yeah, so spectra is a very powerful keyword, as a lot of people, know. It has a little bit of toxic play patterns associated with it. Losing go again. Decks that don't have good action economy can't deal
Mm-hmm.
with it very well. So the cards themselves are very powerful. The downside in Enigma generally is that they count as illusionist auras on the board, and there are a few cards that Enigma plays that care about being the only thing on the board when thing happens. Either they enter or they leave. And when there is a spectra on the board, and let's say your opponent is like an aggressive deck and they are ignoring that spectra, you are permanently locked out of any effect that triggers when you have an empty board. Things like Rage Specter, things like Solitary Companion, and the big one was Spectral Manifestations, right? And that card, which we were playing before, fueled the 10,000 Year Reunion and the Restless Coalescence game plan. If we ever landed an early Spectra, that entire game plan was totally shut off unless the opponent decided to clear it, and they just
Mm-hmm.
might not. And that just led to too many awkward bricky hands where you just couldn't actualize the value of what you wanted to do because, you just happen to have one of these auras still out.
Mhm.
With the swap to astral etchings, we no longer rely on that solitary board condition to build counters for those combos. So we're more free to play these specter cards. It's not completely free because we are still playing Rage Spectre, which cares about it, and Solitary Companion, cares about it a little bit. But the value that you can gain from slamming one or multiple of these early, especially against decks that can't deal with them very well, it could just like snowball a game out of control. +1 counters are extremely powerful
Mhm.
in Enigma because they give the auras go again,
Mhm.
and they just accumulate more value the more turns that they stay on the board, and they can fuel something like Restless Coalescence. So Shimmers is just could solo win you the game if they don't deal with it, and
Yeah.
a lot of times decks have problems dealing with it. And because of, we're going into a metagame where there's more decks that can't deal with it, slower decks. We don't have to worry about Zen killing us in 2 turns. We can capitalize more on the value that this and haze bending can gain over the course of a longer game. And then it gives us extra high roll potential, like we talked about earlier, with Meridian Pathway able to cheat out multiple of these. So a lot of the way the deck has come together has been kind of a cascade from what the new arm piece is doing for the synergies between the cards. And because of those new pieces, the way they work together, I feel like the specters are a decent fit back into the deck.
Absolutely. I like it a lot. Let's talk about Warmonger's diplomacy. Now, you have this in the main board. Is this one that kind of comes in and out, or is it another titanium bauble type situation where it's good, it's good. When it's not, it's doing other things?
It's definitely the most titanium bauble like card of all of the blue 3 blocks in the deck.
Okay.
However, because it is a blue 3 block, you pretty much, I don't think I really take it out too much. Maybe once in a while. It would be one of the first, to go if a blue 3 block needed to go in a matchup. But
Okay.
generally, you're going to mainboard it just because Enigma can be kind of tight on sideboard slots, so you don't
Mhm.
really have the luxury to swap this out for something. And even if you did, it's like you're getting a marginal upgrade on a blue 3 block that like might never come up in a game. So you need blues, you're going to pitch them, you're going to block with them. This is like fine to play in the deck. But obviously, when it is relevant text, because you're playing against something like Azalea or Viscerai that really needs to be able to play both attacks and non-attacks, this card could just totally shut them down.
Mhm.
And it's just so valuable with how little deck building cost it is to play it that you just slam dunk, you play this card.
Yeah, as far as a blue that blocks 3 that's kind of flexible in certain matchups, I think Warmonger's diplomacy is a pretty safe bet. The card's very, very good.
For sure.
And let's move on to the sideboard. Talk to me about these choices that you've made. I see Command and Conquer coming in probably when you need a lot more disruption, Unmovable coming in when you want to block against maybe somebody who's dominating big arrows. Phantasmaclasm, I'm sure that's just because it's a big finisher with some slight disruption built into it, but I love this card. So let's talk about this one just for a second.
Yeah, it's similar to Miraging Metamorph in the rate on it. It's just very powerful. A 3 cost 9 damage card is just a huge number. And like with other Phantasm attacks, people aren't over teching poppers for Enigma specifically, so you have a little bit more of a safety net playing stuff like this. Its ability protects itself to some degree as well. This is also another example of a little bit of that uninteractable disruption
Mhm.
that Dissolve Reality is, a little bit to a lesser extent because you're not really denying them value, but if you're playing against a hero who really cares about the texture of their hand and what cards need to function, you could really screw them over by sniping maybe the card they needed to get their turn going, the resource card. Maybe they have a power card in their hand
Mhm.
and you just want to bottom it and make their turn worse. It's a very strong attack. It helps you lower life totals in matchups where maybe you need to do that a bit faster,
Mhm.
and it's just another form of like semi uninterruptible disruption. You don't play it against everything because if it does get popped, it feels pretty bad. It doesn't
Mhm.
have that fallback that Miraging Metamorph does. So when you're playing against a deck that is full of Phantasm poppers, you don't really want this because the the hand filtering effect isn't going to make up for the value that you lost if this gets popped.
Absolutely. 10,000 Year Reunion. Now, this was one I wasn't sure about. It's in the sideboard, I see. Is this
Yeah.
a card that you find yourself playing a decent amount of time? Is it against certain matchups where you need to have like just a big stick?
Yeah, so this card is a lot of fun to play. Swinging for 10 is always cool,
Absolutely.
especially when you do ridiculous things like block your opponent's entire turn, and then your tunic counter comes up, and then you
Tunic for 10.
use no cards to attack for 10. Um, Obviously, this card is kind of hard to play out. 3+1 counters is not particularly easy to create,
Hmm.
and it's not just good into every deck because ward pops on any amount of damage taken. So if you're playing against a really aggressive deck that's attacking you for little numbers a lot of the time, it's very difficult to number one protect this and then get any kind of substantial value from the large ward number. So it's really good against either slow decks that have trouble clearing it, and then you could just repeatedly hit them with this ginormous hammer
Hmm.
while you're blocking, or it's against decks where they're attacking for very large numbers. They go very tall, like Azalea or Brute, and you can get as much ward value as possible. Um, generally you want to attack with this card at least once. If you get
Hmm.
to attack and then it blocks any substantial amount of damage, the value on the card is just insane. So
Yeah.
a lot of times you might try and set up a Meridian Pathway turn where you're playing this at instant speed so you can attack with it on the same turn, or you're trying to set it up with some defenses lined up so that you're pretty confident that you're able to protect it for the following turn. And then if you ever get to attack with this more than one time, the game is just over. Like you just absolutely destroyed your opponent in value. Um, and then the consistency of the card is pretty decent right now with playing the astral etchings stuff. I really like kind of that combination, and it's
Hmm.
another way to kind of like snowball out of control games that maybe you otherwise wouldn't win. I know that in one of my national games in day one, I think the final round of CC, I played against a Levia, and it was such a crazy game because he was absolutely destroying me for the first few turns. Like he had the perfect Blood Rush Bellow,
Mm.
discard Beast Within, Art of War,
Oh
Banish
no.
Shadowpeed, like all in the same turn. Just like absolutely like everything you would want to go right, like absolutely went right.
Hmm.
And I was just getting absolutely destroyed. And then I pivoted on this like crazy turn where I got to flash in a 10k at instant speed, popping my traverse using Meridian Pathway. And I believe I played 10k at instant speed and Miraging on the same turn, like a Chimera, and just threw like 20 damage back at him. And then I was able to protect maybe I protected the Miraging with like the 10k blocking
Hmm.
like an endless maw or something,
Ooh la
and
la.
just like completely flipped the game back and forth. So I was getting absolutely pummeled by a crazy high roll, and then I flipped it and absolutely came back with another ridiculous high roll. It was such a wild game. Me and him were laughing like crazy. But that's just the kind of things that could happen with a card like this, and it
Absolutely.
blocks 3 again, right? So it's not always applicable, but when your cards can solo win you the game, even if they're inconsistent, the fact that they block 3 is such a huge, fail safe. You're always able to at least do that.
I had a phase with Prism where I was building decks that were all about like glistening up a shield to be as big as the sun, and then protecting it and like just swinging this big hammer. And 10,000 Year Reunion is just that game plan made simpler. Well, you still have
Good
to
old,
jump through
good
some
old tank,
hoops, but
tank prism.
Tank Prism, shout out. So very cool though. I love to see that. I think you're very eloquent in the way that you put it. It's blocking for 3 when it's not lining up. It's not going into every matchup, but when it's good, pretty darn good.
Yep. And then the other cards in the sideboard quickly, like Command and Conquer. Like I said before, because of the way every hero has armor and this deck isn't stacking a bunch of disruptive effects, obviously that involve blocking. People are just going to use their armor on this. They're going to use their
Hmm.
Crown of Providence, and you generally need to throw 2 Command and Conquers before it starts to do something substantial. So I don't actually like play this as heavily um, into every single matchup, or I don't value it like super, super highly. It's mainly there because I still think it's very important against Ranger, because they're one of the few classes that still lack
Hmm.
a large armor suite, and the on-head effect is very good against them, and slowing them down is very important. So I really like this card against Ranger. It's good against other heroes that are going really glass cannon and playing not much armor into you, like maybe a Stilio or something. And, again, it blocks 3, right? So it's going to come in a lot of the times just based on that effect too. So solid card. You could play something like Weakest Link 2, very
Hmm.
similar type of effect in the matchups that you want to target that might have a lot of non-blocks, but I just didn't end up doing that route, but I do think it is viable options.
Is there a reason that waxing is in the side?
Yeah, so Waxing Spectre is very strong, obviously. An aura that generates its own counter
Hmm.
on entry is really good. It being a 2 cost actually kind of makes it the most inconsistent aura.
Mm.
There are a lot of scenarios when you know that you really need to block, either to protect something important or to just not die. And this card is really bad at blocking, and it's really
Oh
bad
yeah,
when
two
you
cost
when
War 3
yeah.
is ugh.
Yeah, the 2 cost is rough. It's tough when you draw this in multiples, or in a red heavy hand, or in a hand
Mm.
where it's very important that you block and you can't afford to just like let it go and reestablish with this card. Um, so I found that in matchups where I think that's more likely to happen, I don't like to play it or as many copies as you might think to just like, oh, slam 3 of because it's really good. I find that the inconsistencies of it can really cost you. I really like it into slower decks where establishing something threatening is very important, and you're not being pressured quite as much because you're going to have room to actually cast it and attack with it, which is what you want to be doing with it. Um, you don't want it again when you're blocking. Cards like Waning Vengeance that is in the main board, we'll call it, are a lot better in those types of scenarios where, yeah, you don't always want to just play it as like a bad D react, but it does get the job done, and
Yeah,
the 1 cost is actually a lot more manageable in a lot more scenarios.
especially off
But
Tunic.
yeah, but a lot of cards like in the main board top part, come out in a lot of matchups and
Mm.
swap. So I wouldn't say that like just because a card is in the sideboard is necessarily indicative of like that it's specifically teched for certain things or whatever. But I do put it there just like as kind of a example for why it's not always just a mainstay card and what some of the downsides are.
Now, Dense Blue Mist, this feels like a Zen card. Is it serving a certain purpose?
Yeah, so I still really like this card. Um, Obviously, it was good into Zen because if they were going to attack you 15 times, having a dense blue mist on those turns were definitely important. And, first thought might be to get rid of it after Zen is gone, but there's quite a few matchups in which this card is still really good. The first one, which you might not really think about too much, is something like New.
Mm.
This effect is really strong against new daggers, and you
Oh
generally
yeah.
want to be able to side out some of your powerful blue attack actions into new, particularly levels of enlightenment, because out of any blue that you could fill your graveyard with, that is probably the most devastating to have new steal from you, because the value is just crazy if she gets to play it for free. So you want to be able to take those out. So I like to have something back in the sideboard to replace them with,
Hmm.
and this card being very good against new just kind of fits that mold. It's also still good into other aggro decks that attack you a lot of times. Really aggressive mechanologists like Dash IO or a boost dash, it's very good into, because you can use this on like a high octane turn. You're going to get attacked a bunch of times against a deck like Aurora, or even if you play against a ninja still like Zen Phi Katsu, like they're still going to be good against it. So I just think it's important to have this tool still in your sideboard for a lot of matchups. So I still really like it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's very good. Um, Part of Reflection, is this in here for the AB, or is it kind of a synergy with those new gloves?
So it's in here for AB, specifically Kano.
Hmm.
Although I don't know to what extent KO or Kano is gonna see a ton of play in this meta, but
Mhm.
I try not to disrespect Kano when I can. So having the third AB is pretty important for that matchup. I It might come up that you use the text here and there, but I don't think in that matchup you ever really give up your AB to do it. And I don't know. It's no rune with text. Like
Yeah,
maybe it comes up, but I wouldn't really. If you don't read this card, it's not gonna hurt you too bad. It's not that big a deal if you don't use it. And
hey,
there's not another matchup where you're using it particularly for the effect, because Traverse the Universe is just so crazy that if your opponent is ever gonna attack you with physical damage, you're playing Traverse the Universe.
that's a great point. I mean, at the very least, the artwork is very pretty. I'm a big fan of this artwork. Looks great in cold foil.
For sure.
Phantasmal Footsteps, I see we also have more IB. I assume that's for Kano and Wizards among those. But
Yeah.
Phantasmal Footsteps, are we bringing this in for the block? Like we said, there's not much Phantasm in the deck for you to abuse with this, aside from maybe if you wanted to try and lead with Miraging Metamorph when you kind of know it's going to get popped, stuff like that.
Yeah, so the Phantasm text is mostly relevant. I don't think that's ever really going to come up.
Hmm.
It can here and there in some interesting circumstances, but that's not why it's in the deck. It's there for the block value against aggro decks that are going to attack you on breakpoints repeatedly. This is very good to cover those breakpoints. It also can guarantee that you can use an entire card's worth of resources on your opponent's turn if you're
Hmm.
forced into pitching. So let's say you're pitching to Eviscerai because of Arcane Barrier, and then
Mm.
they attack you with like a meet and greet for 4, right? Well, you can use one of those floating resources to cover up this meet and greet with a 3 block and the Phantasmal Footsteps. So it's just really good against those aggro decks that are going to be attacking you on like the 4 breakpoint, or Mechanologists who's going to attack you with pistol a bunch of times. Like Dash has to close the combat chain if she's doing multiple pistol attacks, so you can kind of double up the value there. Just like those really aggro decks that are really pressuring you on awkward numbers, this helps to cover it and to use all of the resources that you're pitching.
Absolutely. All right. Well, very cool. I think this is a well constructed deck, the kind of deck that I would be a little bit nervous to sit across from, just in how efficient it seems like it's going to be at building and attacking.
Yeah, like I
Cons-
said,
Go ahead.
overall, like it's really all in on the ward strategy. You want to have as many turns as possible where you're either rebuilding or adding to a board, and then you still want to have the defensive tools to defend for a
Mhm.
board. So we've given up a lot of the aggressive attack actions and disruption that older Enigma lists have. In return, we're playing more copies of ward that can kind of overwhelm your opponent that can't deal with that. So like the Waning Vengeances and the solitaries and things like that.
Very cool. Concerning like speed of a match, like how fast or how slow do you typically want to take it? I guess you kind of want to take it a little bit slower. You want to build up, protect, and kind of just overvalue them slowly but surely.
Yeah, so the longer the game goes, you have the ability to multiply the value that you get off of your ward by keeping it around for multiple turns.
Hmm.
And then, like, slower decks will have longer game times, and then you have more opportunities to play more ward and kind of snowball that value. It's not necessarily the case that just because the game is long that you are happy about that. There are times in which a really short game can go in your favor as well, because maybe you just snowball so out of control that they just explode. And, a lot of that would come down to like a Miraging or a 10,000 year reunion, just hitting
Hmm.
them a bunch of times. And so the games could just end quickly because of that. It's really just how much value you're able to get throughout the course of the game, however long or short it is. Even in like a super long game, there could be the case where as you use up more of your ward and your opponent keeps clearing it, your deck becomes more and more of a higher percentage of blues and cheese. And while in the end game state, Enigma is really good in those, knockdown drag out fights in the fatigue state where, her hero ability just kind of overcomes a lot of what other people are doing in the end game when
Hmm.
everyone's deck is full of bad cards and their life totals are low. Um, you also lose out on a lot of your big power turns, and you run the risk of sometimes just not having something to establish, and your opponent able to again flip the game back on you. Maybe you draw like too many chi in a row or something.
Hmm.
So a long game generally favors you, but it's not like as easy as just saying I want to make the game as long as possible. It's more of like I want to make the plays as many times as possible that gives me the road to victory.
How effectively would you say that you use your life as a resource, and in doing so, does that sometimes lead to like a mid-game pivot where you sacrifice a board plus maybe a bunch of your life total to pivot right back into the game?
Yep. So life total is, a resource in a lot of heroes, a lot of card games. It's just kind of a general principle for a lot of the case. That is definitely true for Illusionists as well, because of the way that board state snowballs value. You're more than happy to trade a life total, discrepancy for an equivalent amount of board state value, because that board state is going to gain more value than your life did, right? Like if I have ward 10 and it gets to attack for 10, that's better than just having 10 life, right? You don't always get the opportunity to convert your life total the way you want to, because it's not like the other illusionists where your board can be attacked and your opponent can choose to attack you or the board. In those types of illusionists, if they choose to attack you, you can then say, okay, I'm going to take that damage, use my life total as a resource, and then use my cards to continue to fuel my board. Because your board is threatened when you're attacked, you can't just choose to lower your life total to keep your board and your value, right? Because you
Hmm.
have to protect it. So, um, even though your life total is high and maybe you want to lower it to increase your board state, you still have to defend the board and block for it.
Exactly. So that's kind of interesting to think about then. She, you were willing to use Enigma's life as a resource if you're able to, but if you already have a
Yep.
board state, sometimes you kind of can't. That's an
Yep.
interesting thing that's
She,
a bit unique with her.
she still does pivot, but you have to watch on your opportunities, because usually a pivot will involve you going down to zero board, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you have a board, but the cards in your hand is a much better play, a bigger board, you're able to play something more threatening. Your pivot will end up being like, okay, I'm going to let my board reset and die. And then any
Mm-hmm.
additional damage, come on, I'm going to take all of it. And then you replay a board that's more scary that you can snowball. And you want the life total to do that. The worst position you can ever be in as Enigma is being forced to block for your own life total rather than your board.
Ooh, yeah.
So even opportunities you can to like keep your life total high so that you're waiting for that big pivot, for that big board state hand to come, you want to be able to convert your life total into a resource there, because as soon as you start blocking for your life, it's going to be very difficult to swing back if your opponent's not if your opponent's in any kind of commanding position.
Hmm, absolutely. Well, cool. Let's talk about maybe some strategies. It seems like a lot of your strategies in certain matchups are pretty similar, but are there any decks that maybe you switch it up? Like Zen is kind of falling out of favor, so you've afforded the ability to not exactly build the deck to tackle him. But decks like Azalea, decks like Victor, that are kind of gaining a little bit more traction. I guess Azalea already had it, but Victor seems like he might be a little bit more emboldened these days. Are you probably slotting in things like Unmovable? You're sitting back and like just building up that board state quickly. But what's a deck where you feel like you have to change your plan the most?
So it actually happens quite a bit, actually. So different heroes have different ways of dealing with Enigma, and depending on what that way is, kind of changes how you yourself have to play and value things. So, for instance, let's say you're playing against a deck like Vincent or Riptide, who
Hmm.
have very easy ways to kill your auras without you being able to interact. Vincent has the unpreventable arcane damage that you just can't protect your board even if you wanted to. The Riptide trap pings
Hmm.
can't be prevented, other than with ward itself. So you have to have ward to protect the ward, or whatever ward you're trying to protect dies from the ping. So in matchups like that, you have to acknowledge the fact that your opponent has these kind of easy get out of jail free cards to clear your board,
Hmm.
and you adjust your play to deny their denial of your value.
Mm.
So, for instance, with Vincent, you know that your ward is going to be destroyed with the rune chance if she finds her shadow non-attack actions.
Mm.
So you don't want to over-invest on the ward board state that you have accumulated. If you have a high number of ward value in play and the Vincent is attacking you, if you block for that ward value and you try and snowball that advantage, maybe you'll get another round of attacks, but then they'll go to their following turn, immediately blow it all up with a rune chant, right? And then you lose in that trade overall. So instead you might realize that, hey, it's important for me to get as much value as I can from this ward, so I'm gonna cash it in when I can,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like they're attacking me with their rune gate card. I have some ward up, or I can play some ward from my hand that makes sense to. I'm gonna go ahead and cash in this value and just keep the cards in my hand so that I can avoid it being destroyed by rune chance. Same thing with Rangers and Murkmire Grapnel, right?
Mm.
If I know at any point an Azalea could just randomly knock the death whistle or find a Murkmire on top of their deck, pump it up and dominate it for 14 dominate.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have a big D react or a way to cover that, any ward that I was trying to protect, it just goes away like that and it gains no value. So maybe on a turn where it's not Murkmire Grapnel, I might decide, hey, let me let my ward block here because
Mm.
it's just value to do so.
So that kind of does that equate to a little bit to, get your value where you can, like you said, and use the
Mhm.
ward as opposed to trying to protect it. But does it also equate to maybe holding back a little bit here and there? Like maybe you have the chance to build more, but you keep a card and arsenal it instead of actually playing it that way. If they do manage to do something that you can't stop, you got the ability to build right back.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to overextend into things that you know are going to punish you. Another example would be the Earth Heroes with Summer's Fall, which we've already kind of briefly talked about. Because they have this uninteractable way to just clear one dangerous aura, you don't want to overinvest your resources into one singular aura. So if you dump all of your resources, your life total, maybe you took a bunch of damage, you played all the cards in your hand so that you can set up this ginormous mirror guy, or you play a 10k. Well, if they answer it with playing Summer's Fall, it's just such a huge swing that you don't want to give them the opportunity to blow you out that way. So you just change the way you play a little bit. You don't overinvest in a huge aura. You would rather have a bunch of medium auras, right? So
Mm-hmm.
instead of taking a line that involves dumping everything onto a big mirror guy, maybe I want to dump my counters on a Restless Coalescence, or I want to, play 2 Waning Vengeances instead,
Mm.
because then they don't get that insane value from their counter card because you've played in a way that nullifies that downside as much as possible. So as flexible as Enigma can be, you kind of have that option to deny your opponent's counters to you by just playing it out a little bit differently.
I was wondering if astral etchings could spread the value evenly across three things. I see now that it
No.
cannot. That'd be pretty sweet if it could, though. But that's
Yeah,
very
that
cool. I
that'd be
like
good.
that. Kind of spread yourself a little bit wider so that they don't have one giant thing to clear with that uninteractable card. I like that a lot. Concerning wizards, is Kano still like? I see you're still respecting him, but like, is he something that you're not too scared to run into?
I don't think so. I don't, really know what the Kano players have cooking right now, if I'm going to be honest.
Mm.
But generally, what Kanos did into you before was they would, pressure your ward throughout the game, and then they would set up a pitch stack, um, with their Tome of Aether Winds and their double triple wildfire, whatever they did, to where no matter how much ward you had or whatever the game state was, they could guarantee a lethal kill turn on you, and
Mm.
you weren't really pressuring them fast enough most of the time to deny them from that, because a lot of Enigma's value is put into the defensive aspect of
Mm.
ward, so your raw damage output is stunted a little bit, to compensate for that.
Mm.
So if you're trying to race down Kano and deny him from stacking you, it was kind of tough to do that. And if Kano stacked properly, he could just kill you through anything. Without the Tome of Fyendals or Tome of Aether Winds, he doesn't really have a way to stack a guaranteed kill against ward. So I just think most game plans that you do are going to be good against him. If he tries to like set up something, it's probably not going to get there through an ample amount of ward that you've set up. You could probably just fatigue him out of threats because he can't kill you with those things, or you just win the tempo game because ward is so effective at stopping what he's trying to do. So Kano, I feel like that's a pretty good matchup right now, as long as you don't do something dumb and like play only AB1 into him.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, the ward is just such a big wall standing in the way of what he's trying to do. Plus, you run enough blues, you've got ample AB if you're actually packing it. That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. How about the mirror? Is there anything that you kind of do or adapt for the mirror? Is the mirror just kind of like, I don't want to say a coin flip, but like, what do you think about it?
Uh, the mirror can be a little degenerate.
Okay.
It's there are heuristics you can do, and play patterns you can make that benefit you. And obviously, the more you understand the matchup and how to play Enigma, benefits you just like in any matchup. The mirror can be very snowbally though. There's this kind of back and forth trading aspect to it where the most important thing is to have a big threatening ward that you can constantly smack your opponent with. And if you can do that and your opponent is unable to clear it, you win the game. If you can't, then they win the game, right? So cards like 10,000 Year Reunion are very good in the mirror. Miraging key, just like it is in a lot of matchups. You want to be able to play these cards out and use their high attack powers to threaten any board that they have set up, and then you want to be able to defend those permanents so you can continue to use their attacks. If your opponent snowballs, a board that you can't clear and you can't establish your own board, your life total is going to quickly evaporate and the game is just end. So it's kind of this tug of war of who can build the biggest threat, who can protect that threat, and who could use their threats to clear the other people's threats. And traverse the universe is a big part of that. It's kind of like this game of chicken where I use my traverse the universe to have a big explosive turn, and then my opponent uses their traverse the universe to have a big explosive turn, which then clears my explosive turn because it kills all my board, and then all of a sudden I don't have traverse anymore to clear their board. So preferably a lot of the times you'd want to traverse the universe after your opponent, but you can't always rely on doing that, and sometimes you just have to. And even if you use it first, you can still win the game. It's there's a lot of like little things here and there that come through, but it is a pretty snowbally matchup, and there aren't a ton of like tech cards that you can play that have applications into other matchups, unfortunately. And if you tool a deck specifically to build the mirror, you are losing a lot of equity into other matchups. But as far as this deck specifically, probably relying on 10,000 Year Reunion is one of your best bets.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Getting to swing a 10k at your opponent is going to threaten so their board pretty hard, and it's a big enough number that they're going to have a hard time blocking it too. I like
Sure.
that. I like that a lot. So that's how you approach beating Enigma as Enigma. But here's a tougher question for you. What do you think other players should be packing and bringing in to maybe try and beat you? Is say what's a ninja player to do? What's a ruin blade player to do to try and tackle the threat that is Enigma?
So usually the best strategy against Enigma is to just present as much damage as possible on a consistent basis as possible, and then bonus points if you make that damage awkward to block. So if you're playing a ninja or a rune blade who's able to attack on a bunch of small numbers or breakpoints to where you deny the Enigma the ability to get full value out of her cards, um, it could be kind of tricky for her to protect her board and still have any resources left to do anything with it. Um, if you're playing a slower deck that can't push out those big numbers, you you're probably relying on some sideboard cards that work well into Enigma, and a lot of those again are probably aggressively leaned. And you just want to be able to capitalize when Enigma herself has hands that don't defend well or don't really accomplish much. As Enigma is fairly consistent, but you know, playing a deck with a ton of no blocks, she does sometimes have issues of being unable to defend her board, and also sometimes being unable to reestablish that board after it's um, after you try to defend for it, and it gets just like a lot of nightmare things. So if you see an Enigma stumble that way, or maybe they over aggressively didn't block their board, you can try and like see that maybe as an opportunity to punish them as hard as possible. Um, Knowing what Enigma's play patterns are the best you can, um, always helps. In Fab, it just helps in general to know what your opponent is doing. I know not everyone, likes Illusionist or plays Illusionist, and it can be kind of tough if you aren't Illusionist player to like kind of understand why the Illusionist players are doing the things they're doing. But if you can build those, that if you can build that knowledge and understand those play patterns a bit, you can kind of dissect it and be like, oh, I see that they're doing this, so they're probably trying to, pivot on this play.
Hmm.
They didn't block their board, so their hand either can't block or they have something better to reestablish with. So what is the most likely scenario? What do I lose to? um, I think keeping a card in Arsenal, as much as Dissolve Reality punishes that, which is why that card is so good, I think that's really important because you don't want to just fire off um, your medium hands every single turn, because Enigma can block on a medium level very
Hmm.
well. You need to have those spike turns that can push past her hand. So if the Enigma's board isn't currently threatening and you don't need to push past it, it's okay to hold back a little bit and save some of that explosiveness from maybe your Arsenal power card on when they do want to set up. If you just dump everything on an empty board, she might use her life total as a resource, take all the damage, play a huge board. All of a sudden, your next hand, you don't have an arsenal. Your hand maybe is medium, and then you can't push through, and then the game's out of control. So just make sure that you're able to push the Enigma as hard as possible when she has a board that she's relying on to win the game.
It's a great point. I love the way you put that, specifically because, like, if say you don't recognize that maybe the Enigma is letting the board fall, and you have another head jab in hand that can either just like you can throw at the Enigma now that their board is down to try and get a little damage, or you can hold it back and arsenal it. That way you can really crack back when they inevitably rebuild. Now, like you said, you can get punished by dissolve by doing that. But generally speaking, that's a good gamble to take. If it's clear that they're letting the board drop, maybe they don't have a blocking hand, but typically if they don't have a blocking hand, that's probably a rebuilding hand. And you just got to recognize those little things and kind of see where you can stack your advantages in other ways. Because, like we talked about earlier, you'll gladly use your health as a resource, gladly. So
Yep.
maybe
So
try not to fall into that.
don't give the Enigma the opportunity to do the things that she wants to do.
Yes, exactly. Well, very cool. I think that was fantastic, Aaron. I gotta thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about Enigma today and sharing all this insightful information to our audience. Our audience. Why don't you
Absolutely.
give us a place where we can't find you on social media? Do you have any platforms that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I'm not a Twitter guy, at least as of yet. Taylor's keeps telling me to download it. I
It's
probably should.
okay. It's
Um,
okay at best.
yeah, I've seen some bad things there, but what for right now, I don't use that currently, but I'm very active on Discord. A lot of people have reached out to me already, to ask my thoughts on stuff. Anyone who wants to send me a message, my handle on there is Rainy Days. You can find me in the general Discord, or if you're in the Card Guys Discord, I'm more than willing to help anyone out or answer questions or anything like that.
Absolutely. Well, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors. I want to thank Fabric, I want to thank Dragon Shield, and I want to thank Magnolia Gaming. Thank you guys so much for helping us out any way that you can and supporting us. We really do appreciate it. Makes things like this possible. I want to shout out, the rest of the card guys. I want to shout out to all the Illusionist players of the world. Sometimes you guys catch a bad rap, but I'm one of you, and I think you're great. Aaron, do you have anybody you want to shout out? Any friends, any Illusionist players that have helped you along the way?
Um, Yeah, I think Illusionist players are they can be kind of a tight knit group. We love to talk Illusionists. I talk all the time with people like Dozer, David Andrews, Noah Clark, Ray Adams. Uh, there's a lot of diversity of builds and play in Illusionist, and the way you tackle the game is just so different than other heroes that you really need to understand almost every facet of the game to like really succeed at this type of hero. So talking to other players who have those experiences is just a very valuable um, resource to have. So that's why I'm always willing to talk to people about, and it could just be about Fab in general. It doesn't have to be Illusionist. Like I said, I play other things, but um, I think these heroes are a lot of fun to play. They give you a different way to play the game that other heroes don't play on. So, um, but it's very difficult to get into comparatively to some other classes. So
Absolutely. They do something different, and a lot of people maybe find something to not love about that, but the rest of us find that is exactly the reason to love it. So to all of you out there watching, go out there and maybe pick up some Enigma cards. She's very fun and she's very different. In
she's
any
very good
case,
right now too.
oh yeah, not to mention she's pretty spicy at the moment. Not
Yeah.
a lot of answers to her question. But that's I think that's going to wrap it up for us. Thank you again, Aaron, and this is Willie B and Aaron Grace signing off. See you next time.
Thank y'all.